let's do this very interesting RC, which talks about how rhyming has declined in poetry. So rhyming मतलब क्या होता है? तुकबंदी. Like Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jim came tumbling after. So went Jack and Jill went up the hill to Jill, and hill is rhyming. जैक fell down and broke his crown, ये भी rhyming. So ये कह रहा है कि इस पैसेज में हम देखेंगे how rhyming has declined in poetry. For Jeremy Bentham, a philosopher, poetry was simply writing that fails to reach the end of the line. For W.H. Auden, a poet, poetry was that which makes nothing happen. Arnold Bennett, a writer, disagreed. He thought poetry was very powerful. The mere word poetry could, he said, scatter a crowd faster than a fire hose. तो यहाँ पे ऑथर ने तीन पर्टिकुलर लोगों की बात की है. उसमें से एक फिलोसफर है, एक पोएट है और एक राइटर. And in a very humorous and sarcastic manner, he has given here what they feel about poetry. Because one guy says it is writing that fails to reach the end of the line. Right? So it's like a sarcasm, humorous sarcasm. The other guy says poetry makes nothing happen. And the third guy says, no, it is very powerful. It can scatter a crowd faster than a fire hose. मतलब आपको अगर एक crowd को dispel करना हो तो आप उनके सामने poetry सुनाने लगो and they'll run away. Right? So it's very powerful that way. So these are some sarcastic ways in which the author has talked about these particular people, how they describe poetry. What unites these descriptions of poetry is that none uses the word rhyme. अब इसमें किसी ने भी राइमिंग का यूज नहीं किया. दैट मींस नोबडी हैज मेंशन्ड दैट पोएट्री में राइमिंग होती है नहीं होती है. दैट मींस ऑथर इज ट्राइंग टू सजेस्ट कि राइमिंग is not a very important part of poetry. When A.E. Housman, a poet, gave 51-page lecture titled The Name and Nature of Poetry in 1933, he used the word rhyme only once, and then only in the phrase bad rhyme. तो ये A.E. Housman ने एक 51-page लेक्चर दिया था और उसमें सिर्फ एक बार राइम बोला, वो भी बैड राइम के साथ में. That means he does not consider rhyme at all playing any role in poetry. Martin Heidegger, in an essay titled What Are Poets For, was similarly avoidant. The philosopher used the word abyss 16 times, death 5, and rhyme not once. Similarly, एक दूसरा ऐसे की बात की गई कि उसमें भी राइमिंग को टोटली अवॉइड किया गया. एंड इवन दो द सीरियस वर्ड्स और नेगेटिव वर्ड्स लाइक एबिस व्हिच मींस अ बॉटमलेस पिट और डेथ व्हिच इज एक्सट्रीमली नेगेटिव, उसको इतनी बार यूज किया बट राइम को एक बार नहीं. So what the author is trying to suggest through these two passages is that different people have described poetry in different ways. But none of them have used rhyme. Okay? And even if people have used, they've used it in a negative sense. Poets rarely define poetry by whether or not it rhymes. This is just as well. For now, it hardly does. तो poets define करते ही नहीं है poetry को कि whether उसमें rhyme है कि नहीं है. और ये ठीक है, अब it is appropriate because now there's hardly any rhyming in poetry. P.J. Wodehouse, a novelist, divided poetry into the old-fashioned kind with rhymes in it and the modern stuff about gasworks and decaying corpses. पीजे वुडहाउस एक फेमस नॉवलिस्ट हैं. उन्होंने पोएट्री को कहा है कि दो तरीके की होती है. एक ओल्ड फैशन होती है जिसमें राइम्स होती हैं, और मॉडर्न स्टफ जिसमें कि गैस वर्क्स एंड डिगेइंग कॉर्प्सेस मीन वेरी सीरियस स्टफ. व्हाट इज ट्राइंग टू सजेस्ट इज दैट पीजे वुडहाउस makes a light work of rhymes. That means he kind of has a view that rhyming is a very trivial kind of thing. It's not non-serious stuff. Whereas modern stuff या modern poetry में gas works, decaying corpses में very serious stuff होता है. Economist ने 11,000 poems को analysis किया and they find verse means poetry firmly in gasworks and corpses camp. That means poetry is mostly in this camp, rhyming नहीं हो रही है. In 1900, 80% of the poems contain rhyme. Today, only 45% do. Number of rhymes fell too. The start of 20th century, over 60% of lines rhymed, now only 5%. तो एक तो 80% poems में पहले rhyme होती थी, okay, 25%. Even in these 25% poems, the number of lines that rhyme have reduced significantly from 60% to just 5%. Rhyme, says Wendy Pop, a poet, has become pretty unfashionable. That means rhyming has become pretty unfashionable, and nobody, hardly people use rhymes. Poets use rhymes in their verses or poetry. This is historically unusual. ऐसा शुरू से नहीं है. Poetry used to have rhyme and rhythm. The reason both words are hard to spell is that they derive from ancient Greek. पोएट्री में rhyme और rhythm होता है, और ये दोनों वर्ड हार्ड टू स्पेल है क्योंकि ये ग्रीक से आया. अगेन a little humorous. The oldest recorded rhyme is from China in the 10th century BC. This ubiquity and longevity in that brain is hardwired to notice rhymes, says Samuel J. Kaiser, author of Played Against Sam, Repetition in the Arts and Movement. तो ubiquity means हर जगह present थी पहले. Most of the poems used to rhyme. Or longevity means it's been there since for a very long time. It's been there since 10th century BC. So human brain is hardwired to notice rhymes. That means we have it in our brain that we can notice rhymes very quickly. Other things reveal this too, such as sheer ease with which you can detect rhymes in a text. A rhythm can be hard for you to see. तो आप बहुत इजी तरीके से राइम्स डिटेक्ट कर सकते हो, रिदम करना मुश्किल होता है. दैट लास्ट सेंटेंस फॉर एग्जांपल वाज इन iambic pentameter, but you probably did not notice. So the last sentence, the rhythm can be hard for you to see. This is like a iambic pentameter, which is like a rhythm style. So he says that this people cannot really figure out कि इसमें ये iambic pentameter है, but rhyming है कि नहीं ये बहुत जल्दी पता पड़ जाता है. But you probably did not notice. Noticing rhyme in text is easier. If it's got, you can spot it. अगर है तो पता लगा लो. So what he's trying to suggest in this paragraph is that it's not that choose a rhyme नहीं थी. From 10th century, earliest rhyme was in 10th century. It was recorded. और इसके कारण brain जो है hardwired. At the start of 19th century, around half the population was literate. By the start of 20th, 97% was. This was good for egalitarianism. Egalitarianism means equality. Egalitarianism, equality. But bad for intellectual egos, since poetry does not merely confer pleasure but status. In an era of low literacy, the mere ability to read a poem set someone apart. As the era of mass literacy dawned, another marker of intellect was needed. It came in the form of modern. So now he's giving a different reason that why rhyming is going out of fashion or went out of fashion in the 20th century. So 19th century start में only half the population was literate. 20th के start तक 97%. He is talking about globally, not in India or anywhere. तो ये इक्वालिटी के लिए तो बहुत अच्छा है that people everybody is getting educated. लेकिन इंटेलेक्चुअल ईगोज के लिए बैड है, क्योंकि पोएट्री डज नॉट मियरली कॉन्फर प्लेजर बट स्टेटस. पोएट्री पढ़ने से आपको सिर्फ प्लेजर ही नहीं मिलता बल्कि स्टेटस भी लगता है. पीपल फील दैट दे आर लाइक द क्रीम ऑफ द सोसाइटी इफ दे रीड पोएट्री. तो इन द एरा ऑफ लो लिटरेसी द मियर एबिलिटी टू रीड अ पोएम सेट समवन अपार्ट. तो अगर जब आसपास सारे अंधे हैं तो काना राजा होता है. तो दैट मीन्स इफ पीपल आर इलिटरेट देन इवन इफ यू कुड रीड अ पोएम दैट सेट यू अपार्ट. But as mass literacy dawned, that means as people grew more and more literate, almost anybody could read a simple poem. But another intellect marker was needed, and it came in the form of modernism. तो modernism करके एक movement है literature में, वो आ गया 20th century में. In the 20th century, many art forms became more abstruse. Abstruse means abstract, difficult, vague. Okay, abstruse means vague, not very clear, inaccessible, and difficult to appreciate. Says Stephen Pinker, a professor at Harvard University, possibly as a way of differentiating elites from the hoi polloi. Hoi polloi means masses. तो अब ये कहने की कोशिश कर रहा है कि पोएट्री में ये जो वेगनेस और ये इनएक्सेसिबिलिटी और डिफिकल्ट टू अप्रिशिएट वाली चीजें हैं, ये क्यों आई? क्योंकि लोग अपने आप को डिफरेंशिएट करना चाहते थे. दे वांटेड टू बी कॉल्ड एज एलिट. सो इफ यू आर एंजॉयिंग दिस जस्ट लाइक क्लासिकल म्यूजिक and normal pop music. So if pop music anybody can enjoy, but classical music, when people go, they think that they are superior to others because only they can enjoy. Not everybody can enjoy. So they think themselves as elite. So इसलिए ये इन्होंने पोएट्री में राइमिंग हटा दी. Any fool can enjoy an enjoyable thing, but only a committed intellectual can enjoy an unenjoyable. So now again he is very very sarcastic here. He calls this non-rhymed poetry as unenjoyable. And he says only a committed intellectual can enjoy an unenjoyable. By the mid-century, rhyming lines had fallen by half. So another reason he's giving for reduction in rhyming, that is that most of the people became literate, and therefore there was some way needed for people who thought of themselves as intellectuals, who would separate themselves, and by making this poetry a little more vague, without rhyme, perhaps they thought that they would be different. They will be able to enjoy something which is unenjoyable. Another possible cause of decline is market forces of their absence. Once poets made money by selling poems. एक जमाने में poets जो थे वो poem sell करके money make करते थे. Lord Byron's The Corsair shifted 10,000 copies in a day. Readers wanted rhymes, so poets provided. So this was market forces that were dictating that poetry had rhymes, because people paid to buy that poetry which had rhymes, and therefore poets provided them. But in 20th century, it became possible, as the poet Philip Larkin pointed out, to make a living less by poetry than by being a poet. Now, what does this line mean? Make a living less by poetry than by being a poet. That means somebody becomes a poet. He starts being called a poet. Okay, now one of your let's say, one of the things that you do is you create poems. But he says you can't make money by selling, by writing poems. Rather, just by being a poet means you may be on the board, maybe in a college teaching, or in a school teaching English literature or poetry, or you could be on some review or a critic review. So by being a poet, you can make money, not necessarily by writing poetry. So this is why you need those rhymes in order to sell, because you could make money just by being a poet, being recognized as a poet. Uh, so to be recognized as a poet, you may not need to be writing poems. You may be, okay, you may have written poems in the past, but you could simply be heading an English department somewhere or doing something else, right? And you can make money. So you don't need to sell poems to make money. It seems rhyme like poetry, the whole audience has quietly slipped out the back. So very interesting passage. This passage, if we talk about the main ideas, the main idea is uh, that rhyming has gone down consistently in poetry, dictated by A, the mass literacy movement that required the elites to differentiate themselves from others by making poetry vague and inaccessible. And second, by market forces, which is that earlier people demanded rhymes and therefore poets had to write rhymes in their poetry. But now a poet hardly makes money by selling poems or writing poems. So he could survive by just being a poet. And therefore, when there is less market demand, then people will not cater to it. So therefore, uh, rhyming is going out of uh, fashion with poetry. So let's look at the questions here. In the last paragraph, what could the author possibly mean by saying it became possible to make a living less by poetry than by being a poet? So as I mentioned when we were reading these lines, that आप सपोज आप पोएट्री लिख के धीरे धीरे पोएट बन गए. अब पोएम तो आपकी बिकती नहीं है, लेकिन आपको उसके बिकॉज यू हैव बिकम recognized and known, so you are maybe put in charge of an English department in a college or school, uh, or through in some societies, and you are able to make a living there. So therefore uh, you don't need to write poems which people like. You can simply make money by being a poet. तो देखते हैं इसमें से कौन सा फिट होता है. पोएट्स इन द 20th century could earn money mainly through commercial success of their poems. अगर कमर्शियल सक्सेस ऑफ द पोएम्स से उन्हें पैसा बनाना होता तो फिर तो उन्हें वैसी पोएम बनानी होती ना जो लोग चाह रहे हैं. तो पीपल वांटेड poems with rhymes, but gradually that was coming out of fashion, right? So author makes a living less by poetry. So author could earn poetry by commercial success of poem. This is exactly 180 degrees opposite, right? ये बिल्कुल उल्टा है इसका, इसलिए ये गलत आंसर. Poets increasingly made their living through roles, reputations, or academic positions rather than through the direct sale of their poetry. Yes, this makes sense. Right? This author could possibly mean by being a poet means कि आपके जो रोल है या रेपुटेशन है आपकी या कोई एकेडमिक पोजीशन है, उसके बेसिस पे आप यू आर मेकिंग योर लिविंग. Poets stopped writing poetry and pursued entirely different professions. ऐसा कहीं पे भी नहीं है. By being a poet doesn't mean that by pursuing a different profession. This is wrong. Poetry became so popular that everybody wanted to become a poet. बिल्कुल नहीं, ये गलत है, उल्टा बोल रहा है. Correct answer is B here. So I hope it is clear. Question मुश्किल नहीं था, easy था. The passage suggests the decline of rhyme in poetry is not associated with each of the following developments except. So I think there is a mistake here. I should not have put this. Yeah. So let's do this question again. The passage suggests that decline of rhyme in poetry is associated with each of the following developments except. That means the reason for decline of rhyme in poetry because of three factors. One did not affect. Rise of modernism and desire among elites to distinguish themselves intellectually from the masses. Yes, there is a very clear mention of this कि modernism का rise हुआ और elites अपने आप को distinguish करना चाहते थे, तो rhyming poetry में कम हो गई. It is very clearly given, so not the answer. The shift in poetry, the economic model with poets earning more from their status or roles than from the sale of poems. ये यही पे भी बात की हमने ऊपर. This also is one reason why rhyming has come down. Increase in literacy level of the population from 50% at the start of 19th to 97. Yes, this also has been mentioned. So correct answer is D here. The growing popularity of iambic pentameter as a dominant poetry form. This is not, of course, iambic pentameter का mention है वहाँ पे, but it is not in this context here. And therefore, the decline of poetry is associated with these three, A, B, C, and not D. All right, let's move to the next one. Which of the following can be logically inferred from the passage? If literacy rates had not risen, modernist poetry would not have gained prominence. So देखो literacy rates, this is like saying that A happened and therefore B happens. So if A happens, then B happens, right? So can we infer that if A does not happen, then B does not happen? No. This is basically deductive reasoning, wherein if A then B, the implication is if A happens then B happens. This does not mean that if A does not happen then B does not happen. ऐसा नहीं होगा, ऐसा नहीं हो सकता है, क्योंकि जैसे हम इसका एक एग्जांपल लेते हैं. सपोज आई से दैट इफ it rains, the streets get wet. So it rains, streets get wet. Definitely we can infer. But if it does not rain, can we infer that streets do not get wet? No, because streets may get wet by some other means. So it is not necessary, right? Especially if A then B, the implication A implies B hota hai, but not A implies not B nahi hota hai. So this is wrong. Okay, this we teach in deductive reasoning. The decline of rhyme in poetry is irreversible given current artistic trends. ऐसा कहीं पे तो ऐसे मैंने बोला है कि राइमिंग जो है वो अब चली गई है, वापस कभी नहीं आ सकती. इट इज irreversible, so this is wrong. Poets like W.H. Auden and A.E. Housman deliberately avoided rhyme to distinguish themselves from traditionalists. No, W.H. Auden and A.E. Housman के बारे में ऑथर ने फर्स्ट 2 पैराग्राफ्स में रेफर किया है just to describe what they felt about poetry. It is not about they wanted to avoid rhyme and anything else. So this is wrong. Commercialization of poetry in 19th century led to a preference for simple rhyming verse. ये यहाँ पे लास्ट में जो लिखा हुआ है, Lord Byron's corsair shifted 10,000 readers wanted rhymes, so poet provided them. So यहाँ से we can certainly infer this. Commercialization of poetry in 19th century led to a preference for simple rhyming verse. This looks like the correct answer. Which finding, if true, would most directly challenge the author's explanation for rhymes decline? So this is a weakening question कि इसमें से कौन सा ऑथर के जो एक्सप्लेनेशन है कि राइम का डिक्लाइन हो रहा है. तो ऑथर का एक्सप्लेनेशन क्या है? फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल, वन इज दैट पीपल वांटेड टू बिकम elitist and wanted to be different from others, normal common masses. That is one reason. The second is the commercial factors. So whatever is the correct answer should actually attack one of these or both of these. Early 20th century literary journals explicitly banned rhyming poetry. So this cannot weaken, right? This rather strengthens it. Cognitive studies show how rhyming poetry is harder to write than free verse. See, this is about rhyming poetry is harder to write, right? Free verse is easy to write. So rhyme का decline ये तो support कर रहा है उसको. This is supporting it. Rhyming poetry is harder to write, and therefore rhyming is declining. So this is supporting, not weakening. Modernist poet wrote in free verse because they believed rhyme stifled emotional honesty. ओके, सो मॉडर्निस्ट पोएट्स के बारे में इसने बताया है कि वो फ्री वर्स में इसलिए लिखते थे क्योंकि दे वांटेड टू बी काउंटेड एज इंटेलेक्चुअल एलीट्स. यहाँ पे उसका दूसरा रीजन बता दिया, रीजन दैट बिकॉज दे बिलीव दैट राइमिंग से इमोशनल ऑनेस्टी नहीं आ पाती. सो दिस इज अ डिफरेंट रीजन. दिस इज नॉट व्हाट वाज गिवन देयर. सो दिस डेफिनेटली वीकन्स ऑथर्स एक्सप्लेनेशन. ऑथर का एक्सप्लेनेशन है कि जो मॉडर्निस्ट पोएट है वो इसलिए लिखते हैं बिकॉज दे वांटेड टू बी सीन एज एन इंटेलेक्चुअल, राइट? जैसे यहाँ पे लिखा हुआ है कि modernism, many art forms became more abstruse, inaccessible. Possibly the way of differentiating elites from hoi polloi. Any fool can enjoy, but a committed intellectual can enjoy this. तो ये यहाँ पे इससे हम कह सकते हैं कि because we are giving a different reason कि rhyming से emotional honesty नहीं आती, इसलिए लोगों ने rhyming करना बंद कर दिया. तो ये definitely weaken कर देगा author का explanation, because author कहता है कि rhyming इसलिए करना बंद कर दिया because they wanted to be seen as intellectuals, right? So therefore this effectively weakens. We'll keep this. Free verse poetry is statistically more likely to win literary awards today. So this is also going to strengthen this. कि अगर free verse poetry को award मिल रहे हैं तो फिर people, why should they rhyme? So this supports it or strengthens it. So this is the correct answer. All right. So I hope the passage and the questions are clear. You enjoy doing it. If you want to keep doing these kind of passages, or if you want to do these kind of passages, you can go to my website, go to the portal, create an account and do some of the free passages or VA questions that I've done. That's it for today. Thank you.